want to welcome you to this webinar of the Soul Repair Center, Resilience and Strength Training, Benefits for Those Experiencing Military Moral Injury, that will be led by Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. I'm Nancy Ramsay, Emerita Professor at Brite and Director of the Soul Repair Center, located at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. I welcome you to our webinar series that is co-sponsored by Volunteers of America Shay Moral Injury Center, directed by Dr. Brock, a Senior Vice President for VOA. The Soul Repair Center seeks to provide resources for religious leaders, VA and military chaplains, and civilian professional caregivers who support veterans and their families affected by moral injury. This series provides information in areas that are under-researched or for which information is not easily available. This webinar will offer resources regarding a program developed by the Volunteers of America Shay Center on Moral Injury, which is directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock, a Senior Vice President of Volunteers of America. She is one of the early and leading voices in education and research about military moral injury, which the Shay Center defines as an affliction of conscience, identity, and meaning because of harm we cause, witness, or experience from others. Dr. Brock was the founding director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth. The author of several books, she is the co-author of Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War. The Shay Center and the Soul Repair Center co-sponsor the webinars offered at this site September through May. In this webinar, Dr. Brock will describe the encouraging results of the REST program, RST, for veterans. With funds from Volunteers of America, Dr. Brock organized a team of 8 experts in March of 2017, co-chaired by Drs. Jonathan Shay and James Monroe of the Boston VA, to create this program. Professor Tim Barth at TCU directed a research team to test the effectiveness of the program during its 2 pilot years. This program is also mentioned in the article, Moral Injury is an Invisible Epidemic that Affects Millions, in the journal Scientific American in September of 2022. Following Dr. Brock's presentation, we'll have time for questions. We invite you to post in the chat. Kyle Fauntleroy, a retired Navy captain, now a director of development at Brite and a founding member of the board of the Soul Repair Center, will host our chat today. And Kyle will forward your questions to me, and I will post them to Dr. Brock. Our program will proceed with a PowerPoint shared and led by Dr. Brock, and followed by conversation between Dr. Brock and myself. At approximately 2 p.m. Eastern, we'll turn to questions that you pose in the chat and conclude at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to remind you that within 10 days to 2 weeks, a link to this webinar and a link to the PowerPoint will be posted at this site and at the VOA site in a tab marked for us, previous webinars. Now, let's begin and focus our attention on Dr. Brock.
Thanks, Nancy. It's what Nancy didn't say is that when the Soul Repair Center that I directed in 2012 started at Brite Divinity School, she was chair of the board of advisors for the center. And so she's been with this work as long as I have, and did really amazing things as the chair of our board. So I'm really grateful to continue to be working with you, Nancy, on this important topic. And the same with Kyle Fauntleroy. We met way back then too. And so we've all been partners in this concern about moral injury, especially in veterans. So I'm going to be using a PowerPoint and making it available. So not to worry, you don't have to take notes, just listen and take in what's of relevance to you. And I want to preface, I'm going to get myself shared here so we can see the PowerPoint. I want to preface this by saying that the first time I encountered the term moral injury was in that 2009, now classic Bretlett's essay on moral injury in veterans. And when I read that essay, they had an 8-part protocol they thought would be helpful for clinicians to know how to do to address moral injury. And it was called adaptive disclosure. And they actually suggested that having the patient, the client, patient, whatever you want to call them, imagine a conversation with a benevolent moral authority to help them process moral injury. And I remember thinking, well, rather than asking them to use the limits of their own imagination of who a benevolent moral authority might be, seems like talking to a chaplain or some real person who might offer that would be a lot more effective. So that was sort of the beginning of my sense that this work of moral injury was a spiritual call out to people who work in the space of spiritual health. So that's sort of what started me on the process of trying to create a non-therapeutic model for addressing moral injury. And so resilient strength training is that model. I didn't create it all. I had the idea to do it and some thoughts about it. I studied group dynamics and counseling in seminary and done a lot of that kind of work as a chaplain. So I assembled a team of various experts in various fields to help create this 50-hour program. And that's the program we tested with a grant from Bristol Myers Squibb over a process of 2 years with about 100 veterans. So I want to start by saying that PTSD, which is what everybody usually thinks about when they talk about the suffering of veterans, PTSD is different from moral injury because PTSD is in the DSM as a diagnosable disorder with a treatment protocol, several treatment protocols, actually. Moral injury is none of those things. It is actually a normal response to devastating conditions. And so with PTSD, cognitive behavioral therapy, helping people rethink things is really important. With moral injury, it's really about accepting what happened and coming to terms with it. So PTSD is the diagnosis of a disorder involving a lingering fear or anxiety response to trauma. And there's a list of symptoms that go with it. The main cause of it is the reliving of the feelings that happened during the experiences that evoked PTSD. Moral injury is a normal response of conscience to harm and moral violations that may or may not involve PTSD. So moral injury can, though, impede mental health treatments. And there's research data on this. It can impede mental health treatments for PTSD, depression, and bipolar disorder and lead to suicidality. So it's a pretty profound form of suffering, but not a disorder. Signs of it are feelings of guilt, shame, outrage, etc. Long list of those. And it is caused when it occurs because of painful moral emotions that emerge after the events have happened and your conscience starts to reflect on them. So that also means that moral injury can be put aside or not thought about for long periods of time. And people often have strategies so they don't have to think about the painful moral emotions attached to an experience. And that's important also to note that there's no time. It's not like you cut your leg and you have a wound. It's that something happened and later on it starts to sink in and you think about it. So this is a Bill Nash chart about all the dimensions of life that moral injury can impact: emotional repertoire, relationship, self-concept, meaning system or concept of the world, authority over oneself, so a sense of self discipline and control, and it's unstable over time. So the continuity over time is unpredictable. Those are all characteristics of ways moral injury impacts a life. So we sought to address a lot of those dimensions in our program, Resilient Strength Training. And we used a military squad model with trained peer facilitators because it's just true that veterans are more likely to trust other veterans, not to judge them and to understand what they went through. So it lowers a bar to establish trust and create support, because the military squad model is a collective model of supporting each other. So we use that model. We also used a ton of ritual activities. In fact, I would describe what RST is more like the Navajo Enemy Way ceremonial system than it is like group therapy. It's really quite different. And that doesn't mean we don't use elements that therapists also might use, but it's really set up to be a ceremonial process over 50 hours. So we use rituals a lot to create healthy habits and enable people to change. And the reason that we do that is that the institution in our society that most understands the power of ritual is the military, because they can take somebody 18 years old and in 9 weeks they can be a soldier, a sailor, an airman, air person. So that is a very fast change in people. And that's because they ritualize virtually everything in boot camp, including eating, walking, and sleeping. And that collective process of ritually doing things together is very effective, not only in changing people's physical behaviors, but also their internal mental states. Because in the process of doing those rituals, they are taught the values of military service that include honor, courage, integrity, all of those sorts of things, as well as shooting without thinking. These are all parts of the process of becoming a member of the military. So we use rituals as well to unwind that process. We also instructed people in demonstrated self-calming strategies, which include mindfulness breathing. We also worked on emotional awareness, like becoming more aware of the kinds of feelings that are coming up with moral injury and being able to communicate more effectively around those things. We also gave them opportunities to express empathy to each other, which was really important because that process also helped them develop greater empathy for themselves and to enhance their sense of self-esteem, because they're not just there to get better themselves, they're there to help other people. So it's a 50-hour program. Our groups were small and co-facilitated by trained veteran peer facilitators. And they went through quite a lot of training. They had to, except for the first sets of peer facilitators, we drew all of our facilitators from people who had gone through the program and experienced it, and then we trained them over a period of about 4 days. We had an administrator who was the person running the program on site whenever the groups were meeting. And if that administrator was not a clinician, then we also had an on-call clinician so that the peer facilitators never had to handle a mental health problem that they weren't trained to handle. And the clinician was also provided to anyone in the small groups who wanted a separate one-on-one conversation with a clinician. That was rarely used, but we had that just in case. And we also sometimes called the clinician when we had a group dynamic thing we weren't too sure how to handle. So the backup clinician is just a standard in peer specialist work that you need that to support your peer specialist. So we provided that. And then we had 3 versions we tried. We did 2 versions with retreat centers, 5 days all at once, all of the 50 hours as an intensive. And then we did 2 long weekends to make up for that time, to make the 50 hours. And then we did one that a couple of them actually that were requested by veterans who were employed at the VA or at VOA veterans facilities, or were students. They just couldn't take a 5-day week or 2 long weekends. So we did a day a week for 6 weeks. So those were the versions we tested, and they all produced good results. Although I think the intensive 50-hour version all at once is the most effective way to deliver this program. So the components included preliminary introductions, and then we asked the group, we had our own ground rules that you couldn't be using drugs or alcohol, except for prescription drugs. You had to have permission from your clinician if you were under mental health diagnosis and care. And you agreed to go to all the activities. So we had a few things that they signed that they would agree to do. But then we also asked the group to set some ground rules about confidentiality. How much confidentiality were they comfortable with and wanted? And so they negotiated another list of ground rules. And some groups came up with 2 or 3, and some groups came up with 8. I mean, it was very interesting to see what the groups themselves agreed to do in terms of their ground rules. And then we just showed them a 10-minute video that Bill Nash did for us that defines what moral injury is. It's a really excellent definition, and he brought the credibility of being a combat veteran himself, and 30 years a Navy psychiatrist and a researcher on moral injury, but it meant he was also a peer to the people who were in the group. And so After the preliminaries, we started the ritual ceremonial process with a bell. We had singing bowls and bells and things like that that would signal the beginning of a process. And then we taught them how to breathe mindfully, that deep breathing that actually lowers the cortisol in your body. And then we introduced them to the practice of deep listening, which is listening with a quiet mind and open heart. And all of the trauma sharing exercises were done in the mode of mindful breathing and deep listening, which meant that each person could share as long as they needed to share. And then that time of sharing would be followed by silence, just listening. And there was no crosstalk or conversation during those sessions of sharing, but rather we just let the full emotional presence of what that person shared sit in the room as a real thing for people to take in. And of course, when people share difficult or traumatic experiences for the first time, often they need that time themselves to hear what they said, because they haven't actually ever said it before. And that hearing of themselves is a first step to processing. We also used those ritual structures of repetition to establish habits of behavior, which meant once they learn how to breathe mindfulness and mindfully, the facilitators were able to use that when a group got bollocksed up or sort of overactivated by something emotional that was shared or happened in the group. Just the return to mindful breathing would help them calm down. And we had a lot of veterans say, wow, I figured out I could do that myself when I was upset. So that taught them that kind of behavior of self-calming. So they weren't so easily activated by their emotions. We also used guided meditations after they had breathed to help them recall traumas in very sensory and specific ways. And then we use writing after the guided meditations so that what they had just remembered in the guided meditation could be written down. And we found that was done partly so that, number one, they would have a record of what they remembered, but also so when they shared, they could control how much they shared. And if they weren't comfortable sharing what they wrote, they could summarize it or tell about part of it or read part of it. They didn't have to read everything. But generally, when somebody actually took the risk to read something and make themselves really vulnerable, that empowered others to do the same. But we didn't want people to feel overexposed or forced to say things. And sometimes people blurt things as they speak them for the first time. So we asked them to write first. And we also had them journaling also during times when they weren't in session. But the writings after guided meditations were free writes and they were timed. We also had them on the second day together make a mask of their military face. And in the slide, you can see some of the masks of some of the groups that made their masks. And for some people, a lot of trauma and difficulty isn't verbal, it's sensory though. And so the mask making would often surface things that people were surprised when they saw what they had put in their mask. So we used the mask making activity that was inspired by a person who had done this at Walter Reed. And National Geographic had done a story about it and showed those masks, and it was such a powerful visual act. So we included it in our program. And then we had popsicle sticks. This was not something our design group decided to do. It was something one of our administrator in Los Angeles liked to do this with her. She's a clinician and she would do this with clients sometimes. And we pass out popsicle sticks to everybody. And after each sharing session, which is usually about 2 hours, they would stop and write on the popsicle sticks a word or a phrase of something that meant something to them in that 2 hour period. And it might be that they would write thank you and give it to somebody in the group, or courage. And so there were these exchanges of written popsicle sticks that happened at the end of each session, which became really important near the end of the program when we asked them to put all of their popsicle sticks together and build a new moral house that represented their group. And that was also a new activity we added because of the popsicle sticks. It was not something that the design team thought of, but when we had too many of these houses, and because no one would take them home, they'd take a picture, the administrator had to find a place to put them. And we just sort of ran out of room to store them. And when we're going to kill, we just said, oh, we got to stop and do something else next time. And everybody who'd been through the program said, don't do that. The popsicle sticks were really important because that conversation they had to have about what kind of house they would build and what sticks went where was really an important values clarification process for them. And in a couple of the groups, we had people who didn't make it through the whole process. So the group actually made a figure that was at the door of their house, unprompted by us. This is just something they did. The person was at the door of the house because they couldn't get in all the way. So they didn't want to leave them behind, which is a military also ethos, leave no one behind. So they didn't. They put the person in the house, but not all the way in at least in the structure. And we also included an hour of spiritual practice every evening before dinner to calm them down for getting ready for evening. Our evening activities were more lighthearted in preparation for going to bed to have good sleep. So we used labyrinth walking meditation, yoga, all kinds of different kinds of spiritual practices based on what the pair of facilitators in the group were comfortable leading for that hour. And so the narrative arc of our process began with childhood memories. We asked them to remember a person who had loved and supported them at some point in their growing up years. It might be a person who also hurt them, and that was okay. But to begin with a childhood memory of love as the story of the narrative of their life, rather than the moral injury taking up all that space. And then their military experiences that were stressful and trauma, and then trauma processing. So the first 3 days first half of the process was all of that. And then we began with reflections on those experiences, with the construction of a moral house and new meaning. And then we asked them at the end to make a commitment to some kind of service project afterwards. And for a fair number, they wanted to become facilitators in RST as their service project. So the power of rituals, and I want to say a little bit about this because I think people don't think much about rituals in post-Enlightenment modern culture. The Protestant ethos was to reject rituals as Catholic superstition. And so there has been some liturgical and ritual renewal happening in Protestantism, but modern Western societies are what researchers on ritual call sort of impoverished of ritual a lot of the time. And you can see the contrast when you look at military training and how ritualized military life is. It's very ritualized, even in terms of how you walk past somebody, you have to salute based on rank and all kinds of things. And this is all coded ritual activity. So rituals help people integrate things that are powerful forces in life, but are difficult otherwise to handle, which include death, strangers, sickness, sex, and especially adolescent development of sexuality and gender, birth, moral failure, and violence. These are all things that rituals help us handle and get, as it were, our arms around so they don't utterly overwhelm us and take over our lives. And so you see in these images 2 adolescent rituals for girls where they enact being an adult. And so that marks, from the beginning of the ritual to the end of a ritual, a change in life status and transition as they move into adulthood. And then you see that Christian baptism is, in some traditions, it's called believer's baptism. So people are baptized when they actually make a personal confession of faith. And that signals a transition from being outside to being inside a church community. So there are many of these kinds of rituals that help us with difficult forces in life. And they do that by establishing what's called a liminal space, which is outside of ordinary space and time, so that it's a place for imagination to work and empathy to work and all kinds of things to work outside ordinary time. It's sort of the way when you go to a baseball game and the umpire says play ball, you enter a space and time that's not on a clock. So, and yeah, I've been to baseball games that lasted hours, and I've been to baseball games that were pretty fast, but it's not it's not on a clock. It's just whenever the last out happens. That's a ritual space. It's a play space, and in fact, some people equate aspects of ritual to aspects of games and play. They also aid in creative change by being permeable to things that are difficult, ambiguity and difference, and create ways of handling those things in good ways when they might otherwise be a real threat. They relieve, and this is why I think our program, one of the reasons it's effective, is that rituals relieve the pressure on individuals to change themselves. I was talking to somebody who was in therapy, and I said, well, yeah, what we do in group work is different from therapy. In therapy, the person being treated has to do all the work to change themselves. And she said, oh my God, yes, it's such hard work. And I said, well, when you're in a group, different things happen in a group. And individuals sort of change each other. They give each other space to do that by overriding personal sincerity with empathy and relationship support. By overriding personal sincerity, I mean, when you enter the military, they don't care what you think about drilling and sleeping and eating. They don't care what your personal sincerity is about those things, because they just want you to learn to do those skill sets. And ritual can do that. It's as simple as in a Christian church, when you're passing the peace to people, you may shake hands and give the blessing of peace to someone you don't even like. But you do it because whether you like them or not is not the point. The point is to do the ritual because you want to live into a world where people can do that with each other. So that's the way ritual can help, because everybody else is doing it too. So it's not up to you to change yourself to be peaceful with everyone. And then they use imagination. They use what's called a subjunctive mood, what's called an as if mood, to perform the change that people want to have. So there's that sort of living into hope, living into a change that ritual also supports and provides. And so we had quite a number of these kinds of rituals in RST. And then we had groups that wound up changing what we were doing. So this is a picture of our very first group that happened in Los Angeles. It just so happened that the program administrator had worked at this housing facility for veterans with children. It's an affordable housing system for veterans with children, mostly women. We did not know at the time, but it turned out that it was especially for women veterans with children who had a diagnosis of military sexual trauma. But we didn't know that when we ran the group, but we had 7 women from the group go through it as our very first group. So it was women only. And Robert, in this photo, Robert was one of the 2 facilitators we trained. And the other was an African-American woman. And we got nervous about asking them to have a man in the group. So we worked it out that Robert could volunteer to leave if they didn't really want him there, and he wouldn't take it personally. But they were fine with him in the group. It turned out to be just fine. Amazing things happened in that group. And at the end of the week, they wanted to have a fire the last night together in order to burn all the things they felt like they could let go of. And we hadn't thought to do that, but we thought that's a very cool ritual idea. And so this is Southern California, so we had to be very careful to be in an all concrete area with a very small fire. But the retreat center figured that out with a small barbecue pit. And we had a ritual in which each member of the group read a list of things they were willing to let go of, and then they put the list in the fire and watched it burn up. And then there was a time of silence as it burned, and then the next person would read. And one of the women in the group had written during the week a letter of forgiveness to the person who raped her in the military. And she read that letter. It was really astonishing. And she said, so I can let this go. And she put that in the fire. And then there was a woman who started out by saying, all of my life, I've lived in pain. I was sexually abused by multiple members of my family. My mother didn't love me. I went into the military to get a better life. I got raped in the military. I came out addicted to drugs. I went to prison for 13 years. And then I was homeless. And she had just moved into that housing development with her 6-year-old son, which is a second son. She'd lost custody of her first son. And she said, so I realized this week, I don't have to be in pain. And so she put her pain list into the fire. And at a reunion 2 years later, I met her 22-year-old first son that she'd lost custody of, who was living with her again, and her now 8-year-old son that she was living with. And the 22-year-old pulled me aside privately and said, I want you to know that even though this program is just for veterans, it's also for the families, because when my mom came home from the program, she was so different. She stopped yelling at us and stopped being mean to us, and she started listening to us. And I think your program saved our family. So that was 2 years later after she'd been through the program. So she meant it when she said she let go of that pain. So those kinds of this fire ritual was a container that was a way at difficult processes could be affirmed and released. It enabled change to be validated that happened in the group. And it was a ritual self-created by the group. It wasn't sectarian or religious in any explicit way. It was just something they wanted to do, and it worked. Rituals also integrate arts and spiritual practices, which is also really helpful because then they become habits of behavior. And our rituals also, the whole process of the ceremonial process of the whole thing helped the whole group to create a narrative about their own process as they went through the week, and gave them a way to live imaginatively into hope as they left. And I think the secret sauce was the rituals. So these are the results. I'm just going to end with some of the data that we got that demonstrated that it was a pretty effective program. So there was significant improvement in what's called post-traumatic growth. These poor veterans that came through the program had to take an hour-long online survey before they even started the program, then at the very end. And then we asked them, please, to do it 6 months later. And there was certainly a fall off in the numbers that did the last one, but we had enough to make a significant sample. And I had people say to me, oh, I want you to know I'm fine. And this was also facilitators in our program said, I want you to know I'm fine. I just couldn't stand to do that survey again, so I didn't do it 6 months out. Because this was a very laborious survey. But it measured post-traumatic growth, meaning in life, propensity to trust, dispositional optimism, positive attitudes towards self-esteem, and the sleeper, as it were, was sleep quality. They just threw that into the survey anyway. And it turned out it actually helped people improve their sleep quality. I had several veterans say to me, oh, yeah, I stopped using my sleep meds that week. I didn't need them, and I slept like a baby. So there was that. And it decreased their dependence on alcohol and sleep medications. So these results, this is the other thing, is from baseline to after, of course, there was usually a lot of improvement, but even 6 months out, no one went back to baseline. They didn't go all the way back to where they started. So there was some improvement for everyone. And I'm just going to show you this visually in some charts. So this is perceived stress. Their stress levels went down and continue to decline a little bit even in the 6 months out. So we have baseline at the end of the session and then 6 months later. Then you had optimism. So they achieved some greater optimism and kept that optimism 6 months later. And then this was interesting. Their self-esteem kept going up. It actually jumped higher after they left 6 months later than the before and after just that week, or just the program. And then they also, and this is a puzzle because we don't know what it means that they had more religious involvement. And it might mean they learned to do mindfulness breathing, so they did that more regularly, or it might mean they were already active, but got more active in their religious groups. It's hard, but it's interesting that we saw also more religious involvement at the end of the process. So I'm going to stop there because that was a lot of information about the program, and open it up for conversation and discussion, because I'm sure there are questions.
Rita, let's see if in terms of the chat,
Yeah.
I can tell you that folks are wondering if you are available to take this program to various cities. If you had an invitation, how would people go about that?
Yeah, what we helped our Florida affiliate set this program up for themselves. They run it independently now.
Mhm.
What we did was take two of our best facilitators who can also train other facilitators. It took two of our best facilitators to Florida, and they assembled a group of veterans that they thought would make good facilitators, and we pushed them through the program. So we actually did the program for them, the 50-hour program.
Mhm.
And we had two of their staff people, a clinician and a chaplain, train on how to administrate the program as the program was running. So the LA administrator came to teach them what she did in supporting the program, because the administrator and me, I'm the project director. We didn't know what happened in the groups. She was there to back up the facilitators. So we took the administrator and then I went, and then their two people. And so their two people like attended the debrief at the end of every day. Every day we debrief the facilitators to see what happened, what troubles did they, have they got questions, and what are they doing for self-care that evening so they're ready for the next day. We did all of that with them at the end of the day. So the administrators learned how to do all of that and run the program. And so then they had some people they identified who they wanted to train to facilitate. And so when we were doing a facilitation training for our own program, they sent those people to train to facilitate. So then they had two trained facilitators and an administrator, and they just started their own program. And they had, I think, ran two groups on their own before COVID hit. So that's what would happen anywhere. We would just run that process through, if they wanted to train, we could keep the trainers beyond the time of the 50-hour group to train the new facilitators. That is an
Right.
easy thing to do once they've been through the program, because we have a 125-page facilitator manual. Right. So, and so it's very scripted. People don't have to memorize much at all. And we do it very scripted because it's very ritually based.
Would persons, and there's several questions I'm going to pose to you, but one of the questions that follows seems from what you've said is that there is a sort of training as persons come new to being leaders in it or facilitators. That you're keeping a sort of quality control in terms of how this proceeds. Yeah.
And we're really careful about training people to do the mindful breathing because it's such a key component.
Right.
Also, to really get in their heads what deep listening is. It's
right.
It is not about fixing, evaluating, or questioning anything. It's actually just that kind of what chaplains call ministry of presence. And everybody does that for everyone else. So, and the facilitators, that we had one person we trained to be a facilitator who tried to lead a group, and he was just way too, he worked for the VA as a peer specialist, and he was too busy trying to give everybody advice. We just couldn't break him of that habit. So we basically just said, this isn't for you. And he was fine with that. He understood, and he became a great promoter of the program because he benefited from it himself. But we want to make sure the facilitators can really handle the kind of facilitation we do.
Right. And one of the questions is whether the methodology of RST is specific to military experience, or could it be applicable to other folks experiencing moral injury? Yeah.
Well, what we did with the program, when we couldn't do it in person anymore in March of 2020, we pulled together our best facilitators, about 6 of them, and said, you know, if you only had an hour with people online, what would you do for them if they're carrying a lot of moral distress? And we were thinking actually about healthcare and frontline workers at the time. So they told us from their experience of facilitating groups, things they thought worked really well to open people up. And so we created an online 1-hour scripted process we call REST, Resilient Strength Time, and opened it to the public. And now we have a division for first responders. It's a separate website that's just for first responders.
Mm-hmm.
We have one that's veterans only that is part of our one for the general public. But we have had all kinds of people from the general public come to it. It's certainly not, you know, as thorough as a 50-hour program, but it is designed to help people discharge some kind of moral distress they're carrying.
Right.
We've had in our first responder program, I think about 40% of them are repeat users. So some people use it regularly and others come once and find it helpful. But yes, this is a process that could work for anyone. We're actually going to try, we developed an 8-hour version of it and took it to a number of our own VOA affiliates whose senior care mental health center care workers were really fried from the pandemic. And we pushed them through this 8-hour, 1-day process. And in Sacramento with our affiliate there, we did 47 people over a period of 2 days with 4 facilitators. And then the 4 facilitators trained 8 people from their staff to run the same program. Mm-hmm. So now they've got their own independent program for helping support staff who are dealing with moral distress and moral injury.
It sounds as if there isn't a requirement that staff be veterans themselves.
Not if it's for staff. For veterans, we prefer veterans only. For first responder, it's about the culture of the military and first responders, but it's less relevant, I think, for not nurses, but people who work in senior care or frontline work. And I actually think we've probably had some veterans and others come to our general public one. Right. We've had plenty of chaplains come to that one the chaplains in hospitals were really doing amazing work during COVID.
I think the question that I was responding to is folks being interested about, is it veterans working with veterans or active duty folks? And your answer to that is yes. Yes.
And we are actually working, I'm working with Jason Newsma at Duke and Keith Mader at Vanderbilt, who are also researchers in moral injury and veterans. We're actually we have a full-blown developed process of a 2-week transition out of the military that would be required for the military that we're in the process of lobbying to get funded by the Department of Defense as a pilot at Fort Bragg. Because I actually think if you do it before they leave the military, you don't wind up having to do 50 hours with them when they get out.
Right. Well, I hope you're successful in that funding.
Thank you.
There's a lot of things on that list. But I was also struck by, there is a question that you might want to raise. Is the Shay Center doing some in-person work? Like if folks came there, or is this distributed out across the country?
It's the pilot was run in New York and Los Angeles, and then Florida has its own program. I don't think we're all looking for funding now to restart, but we don't have that in place yet. There will be, I'm hoping, in 3 years in Brentwood, at the Brentwood VA in Los Angeles, a major center for moral injury work. We've been invited to be partners in the revamping of that campus so that the Wadsworth Chapel on that campus will be the home for moral injury programs, and they have residential capacities there. And so we will be permanently housed in the Wadsworth Chapel and be running stuff in partnership with the VA.
Right. Two other observations or questions. One was, where could folks find out how to access the online or public 1-hour RST?
Oh, I can just type the links in.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That'd be great. I think it's clear that this could also work for hospice workers. That's one of the questions. So it can work for a variety of caregiving
Yep.
folks. One of the things that I'm wondering about is, have you broached offering this program in VA settings?
Uh, uh, we have, well, I'm trying to think about this. We have had VA employees go through the program.
Mhm.
And a number of our facilitators have become peer specialists for the VA.
Mhm.
So we have that kind of connection, but we haven't had a situation in which the VA is contracted with us or anything.
But would you be open to that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the VA settings for older veterans that may not have had access to this earlier in their lives.
Yeah.
But I am aware that there are VA centers from my conversations, related to other programs that we've developed, where they're using writing, for
Mhm.
example. And so
Oh, yeah.
they're already, and another kind of art, other kinds of ritualistic and creative
yeah.
expression. So I think I can certainly see how it would be a valuable way to really expand access to this program. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. One of the writing exercises that we developed for this it's not an unusual thing. Lots of people do this, but when we put it into the program, it turned out to be one of the most powerful pieces of writing work that happens the entire time. And that's the letter of unfinished business.
Mm-hmm.
And when we did a workshop in Los Angeles about this program in May of 2019, that was before the data was done, but it was after the program was done. And we had our trainers come, our facilitators come and lead small groups of people who came to the workshop to do some of the exercises. And one of them was a letter of unfinished business. And that was just with strangers who were just showing up to a workshop at a conference. So powerful that I was hearing weeping from some of the groups. And when we were in the break room and when the break started, we had to pause. We thought, oh no, this is not going to be very good. But as soon as the people left, those groups said, okay, back at it, because they were really into what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the letter of unfinished business, just, I don't know why but I mean, there's a lot of reasons, I'm sure, but it's just a very powerful exercise.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
One of the other questions that came up was availability of this program for reservists.
Oh, yeah.
Is that presently in place, or is that on your list?
It's
for
a
funding?
thing we're thinking about how to.
Mhm.
We take the script we have and we adapt it for different populations.
Mhm.
Much of it works regardless, but we adapted, and I think it would be really interesting to try this with reservists. One of the people who's trained for our online rest program is interested in that, and so we really do want to take it out to different populations.
Right, I can see how that could be very helpful, since they come home, perhaps not to have anybody that can relate to their experience anywhere nearby.
Yeah.
So I hope that that's kind of going up on your list.
And that might be something we could do in like 6 or 8 hours in a day for reservists, because the 50-hour thing is really for people who've walked away from the military. They're not going back in. And I think a different model might work, a shorter model actually, of just unloading things might work for reservists. And it might be, because they're scattered the way they are, it could be probably done online. We didn't know when we started REST whether anything online would work, but it turned out it was pretty effective. And then we've been offering an 8-hour course for caregivers that has 3 hours of moral injury processing built into it. And that also seems to work. So I think it doesn't work the same as an in-person
Right.
process,
I was going to say, I worry a little bit about the increasing abbreviation.
Yeah.
Because it's the relationships and the trust that builds over time, in my experience, therapeutically.
Yeah. But with our veterans groups, they didn't necessarily ever see each other again after their 50 hours.
Well, together. Yeah, but in the moment.
Yeah, but in the moment, the connections are important. Mm-hmm. But it's amazing how you can build those kinds of connections even in an online format. The hard part is you can't read body language. Mm-hmm. And that's a thing we teach the facilitators to do. so we developed this hand over heart gesture, which you can see on Zoom, as a way for people to signal that they were really deeply moved by what somebody said. And people have said it, it was sort of shocking to them as they were sharing something pretty profound, that all of these hands went up and they felt so supported by seeing the hands go up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something. It's not,
yeah.
But yeah, especially for rural veterans and people who don't have the funds to get somewhere, an online process is better than nothing, is what I would say.
Yes. So do you and the kind of specialist or the clinical expertise that's part of this program, you all calculate or think through how you revise it for particular or briefer or different kinds of contexts?
Yeah, for our 1 hour program, I think there are 3 or 4 sessions of that a week. The company that does our technology platform also has an on-call clinician, and the same clinician debriefs all of our facilitators every month to make sure and to check in. And then I meet with, we have about, I think it's now 13 or 14 trainers. And I meet with the trainers every month, because the way the facilitators train is that they go through a 4-hour process of learning to do all the exercises, and then they have to co-facilitate with a trainer 3 times before they're cleared to do things on their own. And so I meet with the trainers every month also to check in with them to make sure they're okay, and if they're hitting glitches and what they're seeing and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm seeing some affirmation in the chat about what I'd mentioned to you about the VA, that there could be some really useful synergy there and receptivity, and certainly would widen your reach. Their training of chaplains exceeds what we could expect in other contexts, that's for sure.
Yeah. And this is something a chaplain could be an administrator for, to set this up. And the VA has clinical people on staff, so the backup clinician would be easy to call in. And the clinician, the on-call clinician, always came in for an in-person debriefing in the evening of the facilitators, and
which is so important.
Really important. I wasn't in the groups, but I learned an enormous amount from just listening to them. And occasionally there would be some kind of miraculous story or something that happened. And so I would ask the facilitator to ask the participant, would it be okay to share their story? So the stories I tell about the program were all stories that I spoke directly to the person and got their permission to tell the story. I just don't use names. Some of them said you can use my name, but I just chose, I use initials. Yeah, I don't do that. But the story, we had a person in New York who, he was tiny, scared, and dirty. He'd been homeless for 13 years in the woods, and he'd been in prison for 27 years and 23 years. He looked awful. His skin was sallow, and he didn't want to be there. He was scared, and he said, I can't do this, but he wouldn't leave. The only friend he had in transitional housing came to the program, was half his age, and he wouldn't leave his friend, and he couldn't get his friend to leave. So he got stuck in the program, as it were. And 2 days after the program, he shows up at breakfast. He's clean. He's shaved. His oily beard was fluffy. He had clearly showered. He wasn't wearing his dirty parka and hat. He just sort of, and his skin was ruddy, and he was laughing and talking. And I thought, what? So all week he got better and better. And at the end, he said, I've been under psychiatric care for 27 years. And you did in 5 days what 27 years couldn't do. I feel like myself again.
Which says a lot about the power of the group experience, which we've seen in other references to group. Is there any use of power breathing or something like that, which seems so helpful to many veterans?
We haven't used it. I know that the film Almost Sunrise, Tom in that program came to an insight through a yoga process. We've in the training of the facilitators, we train them in the mindfulness breathing for sure. But we also train them based on, we give them a sort of sample of things they could do, like yoga, like Tai Chi, like labyrinth walking or walking meditation. And then they sort of, we give them a little training and something they're comfortable also leading.
Right.
Right. So each group is different.
Sure.
And the labyrinth walking was added because the first group was at a retreat center that had one. It never occurred to us to use it. And then they used it the first day, and it was so powerful. We added that or walking meditation into every group.
Yes.
But yoga, some of our vets could do yoga and felt comfortable leading simple yoga exercises. We also trained our 2 administrators in New York and LA in a thing called trauma release exercises, and they would lead those sometimes. They actually trained in how to lead those. So we had different kinds of things at the end of the day, but we wanted to relax them for dinner and the evening activities. And our first group's evening activities every night was that people got together and shared a song on their playlist and they would dance and sing and
you mentioned our rest for the public. And so there's a question about what does in that, what would being a peer mean?
Somebody from a public, the people who are facilitators are in the group not as mental health specialists or as professionals, but as people who've struggled with moral distress and moral injury and are willing to guide groups for other people.
Okay.
It's just basically another member of the public. And they might not share anything in terms of occupation, but they share that experience of understanding moral distress. Yeah.
There are folks observing that there are a range of other morally distressing experiences that invite one to imagine this could be useful. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because we've got like 4 minutes left, is what organizations or people are you interested in partnering with? We've talked about the VA, for example. Now we've talked about reservists. Or in creating the REST program for their organization. Can you say a little bit about some of the horizon that you imagine for this?
I think anybody who works in support of veterans could benefit from having a program like this, because moral injury affects not only your spiritual and mental health, but your physical health as well. We know people who are positive and optimistic often feel less pain, are less affected by pain. So there's a lot to benefit when you help people with moral injury. Also in terms of substance misuse, a lot of people are using substances to avoid those emotional pains they're carrying. So I think it has benefit in lots of different dimensions. We're also hoping to persuade some healthcare companies to help let us adapt this for their own medical staff, because of course they're losing staff like crazy.
Right.
And the suicide rates among physicians has gone up, and there's all kinds of stuff happening around doctors.
Right.
We're actually running a 1-day symposium on April 12th in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for doctors, just doctors. And we're working with a moral injury and medicine group.
That's good. We're like a minute now. But one of the things
I have 3 minutes on my clock.
Well, yes. Well, I have 2.5, Rita.
Okay.
In a minute of that, what would you like to say?
That I really hope moral injury stays outside the mental health space. I really do. This is a form of human suffering that is ancient. Jonathan Shay's work was on Homer. There's been really good work done in biblical studies on moral injury in biblical texts. I think the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism is a moral injury text. So it's not, as a friend of mine who's a chaplain from the New York Fire Department said, the thing I love about moral injury is it's my lane. I'm a chaplain. I understand this. It's my lane. And it is true that chaplains have a different relationship to people who are suffering than therapists who bill by the hour and have protocols and standards they have to meet. Whereas chaplains, they have time.
Right.
And they're not by the hour, they're salaried, and they can do things sort of outside the box. They can do other things. And so I think chaplains have a special mission, but I also have a friend who's been creating and doing moral injury processing groups in her congregation, and she's finding the relationships in her congregation changing on that basis. So
absolutely.
yeah,
I think ritual resources. I can remember Shelley Rembo's chapter in Resurrecting Wounds that veterans were inventing, were putting together ritual processes that seem to be binding and helpful. So it sounds as if you've put together some knowledge that from pieces of what we've seen has worked. And of course that expert consultation, but I can see why you're so encouraged about it. And
And I had the occasion years ago, not in this, but when I was teaching Native American studies at Hamline University, of studying Lakota Navajo traditions. And I got a pretty deep dive into the Enemy Way process because I was interested in Tony Hillerman's novels. And he got captured by that ceremonial process as a World War II vet. So I knew something about all of that. And as we were designing this process, I kept thinking, this isn't like therapy. This is more like a ceremonial process.
a ritualized, but it makes sense about veterans going into native huts or native
sweat lodges. Yep. I have a friend, Chris Webb, who wrote his doctoral thesis on vets who use Native American rituals who aren't Native American.
Yes.
Because he did that himself.
Well, I think we unfortunately have come to the end of the time, but there's clearly much appreciation for this, and you'll want to see some of the other questions that are in the chat. But we want to thank you for this, and we want to thank the audience. It was great to have you with us, and we hope you'll be back next month. Keep watching our site for next month's program. Thank you so much, Dr. Brock.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes.